Hello and welcome to Pagabo Live, our initiative designed to promote knowledge in the public sector. My name's Tom, and over the next hour, we'll be talking about smarter procurement for estates with our panel of industry experts. If you could introduce yourself now, starting with Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Smith. I work for Graham's Construction. I'm the health director. My background is nursing and then into consultancy and then construction.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We're bringing Karen now.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Carter, our Director for National Delivery at Pagabo. My role predominantly within Pagabo is to support our public sector clients to procure, which is what we're here to talk about today, thankfully. So we deal with all manner of the public sector. NHS is our second largest client base that we deal with, second to local authorities. So yeah, really keen to have everyone here today. Thank you.
Brilliant. And last but by no means least, Nicola.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicola Idle from Soul Advisory. We're the consultancy arm of Soul Group, who are a multidisciplinary company headquartered in Hull, working across the country. We're a co-owned business and originated very much in the world of PPPs in healthcare, but now cover a broad range of public sector clients.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much to all of you. Today's event is, as always, a Q&A session. So we'll be going through the challenges currently facing the estate sector, where the opportunities for innovation are, and some of the learnings from live projects within the public sector. We'd also love it if the audience, you guys, could get involved as well. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you want using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Depending on what device you're using, it may be hiding behind the little 3 buttons that say more. But if you open up your Q&A box, submit any questions in there throughout today's session, and we'll do our very best to get to them at the end. We're also going to be running our usual polls during today's session to gauge everyone's level of understanding and literacy around the topics that we are discussing. And as if by magic, here is the first poll question. If you could fire that poll up now, please, Matt. So how confident are you in your knowledge of public sector estates procurement on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being not very confident and 4 being very confident? So how confident are you in your knowledge of the public sector estates procurement? And what we do with all Pagabo live sessions is we'll come back to this question at the end, and hopefully we'll see some positive movement in the figures. If you could close that poll now, please. So interestingly, we've got a fairly educated audience today, which is always quite useful to have, and it always lends itself to interesting questions from the audience as well. So 37% of people have selected 2 and 37% have selected 3. So a good opportunity there to take those 2s and 3s into 3s and 4s as we go forward throughout today's session. So we'll start off by getting an idea of the most pressing challenges that you guys are all kind of seeing, particularly through the lens of the NHS, which is an area of specialism for all 3 of you. So we'll go to you on this first, Elizabeth. What's the most sort of pressing challenges you've noticed currently facing NHS estates?
The biggest challenge at the moment is funding and visibility of that funding and the priorities and how that funding is going to be spent. It's always been a bone of contention in construction, particularly when we have year-end funding challenges, which we sort of believe just sometimes don't always produce good work or support the estate in the appropriate way, or really support an estate strategy. So funding's the biggest thing for us. Also around the different bodies within an NHS estate and who owns what buildings, and the lease structure also causes some problems, particularly around trying to do estate strategies or move services away from the estate to allow the estate to develop stronger core services.
Definitely some topics that we'll be touching on throughout the webinar there. Karen, from a procurement perspective, what are those pressing challenges that you're seeing when it comes to NHS estates?
I think, which we'll probably come back to quite a bit through the discussion, I'm sure, is just competing priorities. So how do people really understand how to, as Elizabeth said, with funding it's sparse, I think, to say the least. It's difficult to plan, it's difficult to see, it's difficult to know what we can do with it. But when the NHS is under such pressure to make use of their estate, make good, not build for the sake of building, decarbonise, have strategic priorities around what good healthcare looks like. There's so much pressure to do the right thing, I think is the key thing for us in, you know, helping the procurement teams and the estates teams to really sit down and think, right, what on earth do I make of this? What is my plan? What do I prioritize? How do I start to tackle this? How do I just do something rather than do nothing, which generally isn't an option? So yeah, I'd say competing priorities is definitely something we're tackling with our client trusts on a daily, hourly basis, I would say.
So it's competing priorities, it's funding. Nicola, what are your pressing concerns and challenges that you're seeing? Similar?
Very similar, yeah. So we've actually just done our annual customer survey and asked this very question. So we've got some really good insights from the sector, and I guess there'll be no surprises to anyone that the things Elizabeth and Karen have said come up really large in that, very loud and clear. Funding position obviously is what most people are saying is their biggest challenge. But also some of the interesting feedback we got was that in the context of maybe the government messaging that there is more money being put into the health sector of the NHS. So I think people are particularly struggling with the public narrative that people have been told there is more, but obviously that doesn't feel like that's the situation. You're trying to spend or work out how to best allocate that on the ground. Obviously the changes feels the only constant in the NHS is change, the reorganisation. I think it's really hard for people, to be perfectly honest, in a human sense, to focus a lot on this strategic planning, on the day job, knowing there are bigger things that might affect you going on in the meantime. And then the final one I'd probably add to that is still the challenge around recruitment and staffing. I think as an industry there is a skills shortage. People might be carrying vacant posts. They've got the budget for these posts, but they're really struggling to get people into those roles, which is obviously, I guess, some of the things we talk about today in procurement and how we can help with those.
As someone whose dad works in NHS estates, I can tell you that's definitely a problem that he's facing on a day-to-day basis. One thing that wasn't mentioned there is net zero. I'd be interested to get your view. We'll go to you on this one first, Karen, as to whether net zero targets are impacting procurement within the NHS.
Yes.
I think can be a bit longer answer than that, Karen. It would be a very short webinar if I just get yes.
Yes, it's definitely impact procurement. I think it's impacting most things. To be honest, I think, you know, going back to what we were sort of talking about in point one, competing priorities. This seems to be the main competing priority that plays, from what we see, obviously from a estates procurement, generally sort of looking at, again, repurpose of estate, refurbishment rather than new build, so to speak. How you balance the clinical need against net zero targets and strategy is becoming, it's a lot harder. I think a lot of trusts have potentially done some of what's perceived as the easy stuff. So, you know, you've got your LEDs, you've got bits and pieces that you've been able to do potentially with own capital fund. There's been bits and pieces of funding knocking around specifically for some easier elements. How on earth do you start to tackle the rest and balance that against everything else that you need to be procuring, coupled with your skills shortages? You know, there's desperate clinical skill shortages out there, but certainly in terms of people within the NHS who understand estates, have the resource to procure well, to plan all of that. It's this trying to juggle so many plates. It's unbelievable. So, you know, we spend a lot of our time supporting that, trying to help that, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But I think we did a recent survey in decarbonisation, and one of the key things that came up from that, particularly within the NHS sector, funnily enough, was of those trusts who do have a decarbonisation plan, who have a net zero plan, there's around about 73% of those feel they can't deliver the plan because of competing priorities. So there's not a great deal of people out there with a plan that's able to move at least freely without challenge, without obstacles that they're constantly competing against, which again just dilutes the resource that you have actually got there to procure as well. So yeah, yes, it's impacting massively.
Elizabeth, good to get your view on this from a contractor perspective as well.
Yeah, I would agree with Karen. One of the biggest issues when we come to work alongside trusts is whether to new build or reuse, and carbon definitely plays a big role in the direction that we go in. And it doesn't always give the best outcomes. It's quite frustrating that we don't have the data to back up what are the best systems to use and how best we can support. There are different metrics for measuring how much carbon we're reducing. And at the moment, it just doesn't feel very structured. It seems to be a typical thing that we jump on and then we develop all the strategy further down the line, but actually states need that strategy now to help them decide where to invest. Yeah. And what best to do and where to actually make the savings that they need to do. We also work in helping trusts with their decarbonisation plans. And I would agree again with Karen that often there is this dilemma between funding and moving forward with these plans. It's a huge challenge and it's quite a difficult one to navigate with them.
Thanks for your views on that, both. It's a complex puzzle. We're definitely not going to solve it on one webinar, are we? So it's one definitely worth discussing later on. We'll go to you next, Nicola, on this question around the role of sustainability and social value within NHS procurement. And is it creating clarity or is it creating complexity?
I think the answer's both. We'll leave it there as a short answer. I think obviously it's one of those, we're all aware there's a government mandate. Trusts, along with every other public sector body, are mandated to consider social value in their procurement purposes. And I think that's the clarity part, and I think that's relatively well understood. I think where it particularly gets complex is, again, back to my recruitment point, it's another area of speciality that the NHS maybe struggles to recruit people into. So who is leading on that for them and who's leading on it as part of that procurement process? And with all due respect to our procurement colleagues on the call, it is the contracts manager or someone whose role is very much procurement. Are they necessarily the best person to then be evaluating a social value or sustainability response as part of that procurement exercise? I think there's a danger there because everybody knows it's mandated. You get a lot of tick box answers from people, and that it becomes everybody saying the same kind of things, not to pick on any, but sort of apprenticeship type initiatives. I think everyone's well versed in presenting answers around those. So how do you see what actually good looks like, and how do you actually get the most value for it? So we know these projects will generate a social value pot. We know that as a contractor, as a consultant, we will be putting those into our bids. And I think it's something we're quite passionate about, is making sure we work out how you get the best bang for your buck from that investment. What do you understand the place you're working in, the people you're working with, and how do you actually use that money for the greatest good it can achieve, rather than it feeling like it's just something we're all doing for the sake of it. I think interesting on this as well, it's another question we asked in our customer survey recently, and we particularly asked around how much, obviously mandate aside, how much are our customers considering or taking into account the ESG elements, so the environmental side, the social value side, the governance side. And actually, as a sort of ranking, the governance and people doing things the right way came very much top, with the social value, I guess, firmly in the middle, and then the sustainability probably a little bit lower down, but purely on the basis, I think people, they know about it, they know it's important, they're not generally maybe quite sure. Back to your point, Karen, really, is you might have a plan, but how do you actually deliver it? So there are other things that are sort of, again, back to competing priorities that people are considering higher in their decision-making process.
Yeah, interesting findings from your survey there, and sorry, tallies with people's experience on the call as well. We're going to bring up another poll question now, because we obviously referring to net zero and sustainability in the previous couple of questions. It'd be really good to get an idea of the people on this call. We know they've got a lot of NHS estates people on this call, so it'd be good to get your views on how far along your organisation is in delivering its own net zero commitments. So the options are: we have a detailed plan in place, we are in the planning stage, we're just starting the conversation, or we've not started yet. It'd be interesting as well to get a bit of a view, and when we get to the Q&As later on, whether we have that 73% who feel like they can't deliver that net zero plan that you mentioned earlier, Karen, whether that is reflected as well in some of the questions that we get. If we can close that poll now, please. So a pretty even split, although nearly half have said that they have a detailed plan in place. So yeah, we'll get to the Q&A at the end and see whether those that have a plan in place feel like they can deliver it. But certainly there's a lot of good signs there in that there are at least detailed plans or in the planning stage for around 3/4 of the people that are on this in this call today. And just one of the respondents said that we've not started yet. So that's a good sign that most people on the call have at least started their net zero commitments. So move on to our, we'll move on to a fourth question here, and we'll go to you again on this one, Nicola, because I'd be interested to hear from you on the innovations within sort of healthcare estates management and how they're emerging and how they're supporting those existing sites.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, because I think my first thoughts for this was, what do you describe as innovative? Because I think there's lots of good practice around there. There's lots of changing models, different ways of doing things in delivery. But I think in the NHS, as with most of these things, it's what is new? Is there anything new under the sun, or is it all very, very cyclical? And is something that seems like it might be innovative now, something that actually has been tried in the past? I think also we're in that world where necessity being the mother of innovation, we probably assume because funding's tight, because of our lots of constraints, those are generally the right environments for innovative solutions to be coming forward. But I think, and I asked around quite a lot of colleagues with this, and it feels like we're not getting the levels of innovation that we might be expecting at the moment in those circumstances. And I think going back to a lot of the uncertainty that's around, it's maybe hard or more worrisome for people to try and put forward something that's a little bit risky or innovative because of the culture that there is at the moment. I think that said, on a practical level, I think some of the innovations we're seeing are, as you'd expect, probably around data and digital. So also telehealth, moving on to digital health and the different ways we can deliver appointments, treatments, diagnoses. I think that data and digital piece. But also, obviously, the theme of today is about doing more with less. And I think it's using that data and the digital technology to enable that. So to gather the data, gather it in that single source of truth. I think we all know there's lots of data, lots of different places, and how do you make an effective decision if you don't actually have a clear steer on that, or you're using what is the latest, most accurate data. So I think using AI, using different tools to get that data, collate it, and use it for the good decision making, that's probably the sphere in which we're seeing most innovation at the moment. I think aside those practical things, for me, it's very much more innovative ways of doing things rather than practical. So obviously the 10-year infrastructure plan is talking about multi-year settlements. That probably feels quite innovative for people who are in that annual capital planning process, because then it gives you more freedom and flexibility to plan over that longer period of time. And I think as well, just that collaboration between the health sector and other sectors, particularly local government, blue light, I think that's where, again, some of the innovations are coming of, can we do things in that one public estate kind of model? Can we do better together rather than go on our own?
Yeah, thank you very much for that one, Nicola. Good insights there on those innovations that we're seeing within healthcare estates management. Back onto procurement processes, and everybody wants a procurement process to be speedy, transparent, and efficient. So how can those procurement processes within the NHS be modernised to get that kind of that speed, that transparency, and that efficiency that we need? Karen, as a procurement expert on this, we'll go to you on this one first.
Oh, heck, the pressure. Yeah, I think that this question links, for me certainly, it links a lot back to the innovation question as well. So there's a boatload of tech solutions, digital solutions, things that can be brought forward. Certainly not for us in our space as procurement professionals, as you very eloquently put it, Tom. But harnessing that from our supply chains, our consultant partners, our contracting partners, who are alongside our NHS clients and estates managers in helping to understand the estate, using that digital and innovation to really get under the skin of what the estate is for a starting point, what it needs, how we can start bringing about change. For us, that innovation really comes in the form of the procurement process, obviously, as the name kind of gives away at Pagabo. But from a framework perspective and a procurement consultancy, which is obviously what we are, we're constantly striving to find new ways and innovative ways to deliver procurement processes, not just a transactional, pop something in a system and tender it, and something pops out the other side of it. There's that, and that goes a long way to help. But how do we innovate far further down the road when we're maybe thinking about a glimmer of an idea of doing a construction project or refurbing your wards, for example, in 2 years' time? How do we start to plan that? What does that look like? How do we bring in social value aspects without taking the resource away from what's really needed of that person's knowledge? How do we direct that into really honing in and focusing on the estate's requirement, rather than worrying too much about what's over here? What does the community need? Am I doing the right thing? I probably care about where my money's going and how that's having a social impact, but am I doing the right thing by putting my time and resource into doing that within a procurement process? So our innovation really is to try and certainly not take it away from the project, but to provide that knowledge, provide that insight, to give innovative tools that can be used right at the beginning of a process to understand, as a trust. I don't know, say in Milton Keynes, for example, you can pop a project into our system and understand the logic behind your community. What is it your local authority is working on at the minute? What are the clients are procuring? What other projects are being procured down the road that you didn't have a clue about? How can we join that? And that we're going a long way to try and provide those tools into the public sector, which is obviously recognised by NHSE in our NHS accreditation. Because of that accreditation, we have to go to Cabinet Office for approval for procuring any frameworks now. So we have to make sure that they're worthwhile, that our innovations are providing value into the sector. Working with our partners, the likes of Great Ormond Street Hospital, who are behind our decarb framework, CNTW and QAF being our main NHS partners that we work with a lot. Trying to work with them in ways of how do we improve it? How do we go faster? How do we become more transparent? How are we more efficient? And that's really what we see our role as being as an accredited provider into the NHS, is that's the value we bring. Everyone can procure a project. You can procure a building, you expect to go to a framework and you kind of want a contractor to build something out the other side of it. That kind of goes without saying. What else? How do we make this the best possible process it can be? For me, that's starting right at the very early stages of that. That's where we add the most value, and that's where innovation really comes into it. If, again, going back to what we were talking about before, our resources are so stretched, we haven't got the time to think about it, we haven't got the time to plan, we haven't got the time to deliver the plan that we planned to do in the first place. It all catches up. But you're never going to get to the point of using things that are going to make it faster and more efficient and more transparent, which is what we're all striving to do. Might get faster, but it's not going to really deliver the outcomes that it could have delivered had you not had the time to include that innovation. So that was a bit of a wambling sort of answer to that, but I think there's so much opportunity to innovate within a procurement process. The NHS have got such a stringent procurement process, going through strategic outline cases and all that kind of stuff, which I'm sure our NHS colleagues on the call will know very, very well, inside and out. But within that process, procurement's part of it. It's not a big part of it to have to look into and validate along the way. So, how can we use innovation to make more of that? How can we really pull procurement to the top of that without really having to think about it too much?
And Elizabeth, from your experience and perspective, what are the ways in which this can be kind of modernised and get that as a speed, transparency and efficiency that we're all looking for?
I agree with Karen that we should be able to use and employ some digital, but also in order to get this procurement process more efficient, it's about the people around the procurement process and making sure that people understand what they're doing, that the briefs are really clear, and the number of times that briefs come out and the contractors are not really sure what it is that somebody's looking for, and therefore when they're bidding for these jobs and trying to show that they've got the skills, they're not really coming across very well because they don't really understand what the need is. At Graham's and other contractors, we can be very happy to come and help people to develop that brief before they come to the market, to help to speed it up so that when it goes out, you get the response and the number of contractors that you need to bid that project. And that's one of the sort of best ways of doing it. But I would always recommend that you really need to have the right people around you, the right consultancies working with you who understand the framework you're using, and to cut out duplication. The framework's already selected a number of contractors who they know can build. So therefore be very careful, don't make the process of choosing a contractor more difficult than it needs to be, particularly if you're wanting people on site quickly. Look at the number of questions or that whole back end process of how you then select your contractor. Cut that time down so that you can get them on site quicker to be working alongside you to solve your problems.
Well, that's the speed and efficiency ticked off absolutely there, is getting them on site nice and quick with everything ticked off. Before we go into the sixth question, just a reminder that we've got our Q&A session with the audience at the end of this webinar. So if you have any questions for our esteemed panel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Start submitting those now, and we will do our very best to get to them by the end of the webinar. We talked a lot about funding earlier, and funding being a huge challenge. So obviously there's lots of PFI contracts expiring, or the looming expiry of those in the coming years. So how is the NHS preparing for the facilities handback that comes with that, and any future funding requirements? Nicola, your view on this, please.
Thank you. We've got quite far into the webinar without really mentioning PFI. So
yeah, we did pretty well. We've got 20
minutes for today.
That's going to be a record.
It is. I'm just going to expand this question out a little bit as well, because obviously it is right that we're mentioning PFI, but obviously there are other public-private partnerships out there. And I think this is where this quickly gets into a very complex and big topic and question, because you've got PFI, you've got the other forms of PPP, and they're probably all slightly different, or they are all slightly different in terms of what handback looks like, who's going to keep the asset, who's not going to keep the asset, what the actual process for handback is, how actually being ready for the handback looks like. So as a group, we handed back one of the first PFI primary schools a couple of years ago, and those very early PFIs had very slim requirements set out in the contract. So it was very much had to feel your way through the process in partnership. The later contracts maybe have a little bit more, the ones towards the tail end have even more data. So it is going to be a bit of a continuous journey. And I think that makes it really, really difficult for trusts or any other organisation, getting back to the question, to plan for it, because there aren't that many examples out there yet. There are some, but not very many. That body of evidence is still getting built, and there's probably people still feeling very battle scarred from some of those, so they're maybe not ready to share or fully talk about those learnings yet. I think at a national level, you've got obviously the IPA in place, soon to be replaced in the infrastructure strategy again. National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority doesn't quite roll off the tongue quite as much, but they are going to be the arbiter and the expertise in all things PFI moving forward. So there's again that national focus. But I think on a more local level, it does feel like an area where there is not a lot of consistency, again, because there's different forms of contract, there's people at different stages on the journey. There's just people with different levels of internal capacity and resource to deal with it. So if you're a big organisation who has got a lot of buildings under PFI contracts, you're more likely to have, not in all cases, but you are more likely to have a bigger team dealing with that, who can probably not just be firefighting and dealing with the current operational issues. They can actually be doing that strategic looking ahead. If you are an organisation that maybe has the odd one or two much smaller buildings, you probably haven't got that level of expertise and insight in-house. So you are probably starting from a very different place. And I think, again, this is one of the challenges that very much came up in our customer survey. People are in those different viewpoints. And one of the things they particularly pulled out was that loss of corporate memory. So obviously PFIs as a thing originated quite a while ago now, they're at 20-25 years. The people who were there and doing the setup at the beginning are maybe winding down now or not there, and you've got that knowledge gap, and people haven't. It's in essence, I think how we're describing it is very much it's all the work that goes into that financial close at the beginning of the PFI being set up is almost done in reverse again at the end. And if you haven't got the people who have been through that process, it's very hard for somebody else to pick it up and do the process the other way around. I think so. There was a report on this, a White Fraser report a few years ago now, and I think that very much talked about as well that whether people are being collaborative, adversarial, and actually you can hold people to account. You can apply good contract management principles. So I guess for the point of experiment, getting your ducks in a row, understanding, have you got all your paperwork? Can you prove it when you get to the end? Have you documented all your changes and variations as you go? You can still do that and not fall out with each other. And I think that's one of the big things that people need to be prepared for. It's actually, you as an NHS body, as a private sector partner, you are there, you're in this journey together. You are both going to have to get to the end of this together. And what is the smoothest way you can do that in partnership and in collaboration, so that it's I guess as painless a process for everybody as it can be. But I think there's plenty of opportunities around it as well. So in terms of that piece about the future funding requirements, our PFI assets, our PPP assets for NHS, schools, etc., they are going to probably be the best condition assets that most places have. So obviously the NHS did its regional infrastructure strategies last year, trying to assign things as core, flex and tail, and the majority of the PFI assets will be in that core category. They are buildings people are going to want to use in the future. So I think there's a real opportunity there to look at the service delivery model, think, right, where have we got a state that's in poor condition with buildings we're looking to come out of, and how can we make best use, sweating the asset, if you like, of those PFI, PPP assets. So is there any funding we can tap into for changes, variations, to make them fit for the future and to deliver that? So yes, about the pure contract mechanism of handover, but what is the long-term vision and strategy for how we use these buildings in the future? Because they haven't got backlog maintenance and they're in good condition. So we need to make the most of them.
Strategy is required. So we're going to move on to next poll question, following on from that conversation around PFI and PPPs. So if applicable, how far away is your organisation from a PFI contract expiry? So within a year, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5, 5 years plus, or not applicable? Just respond now on those. If applicable, how far away is your organisation from a PFI contract expiry? Within a year, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, 5+ years, or not applicable? If we could close that poll now, please. It's really interesting. While we've had a good conversation about PFI contract expiry, it turns out 77% actually don't have, it's not applicable for them. So that's an interesting conversation point there as well. But there are a couple of people who are looking at 5 years plus. So it is a slowly ticking clock for those guys. But as you say, Nicola, it's all about getting a strategy in place as early as possible for those that have the 5 years to go on that. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation now about the sort of standout projects that have really benchmarked that collaboration with NHS teams and external partners. We'll get an example from each of you on this one, starting with you, please, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I've been working at North Cumbria Integrated Care. We've delivered 3 projects. They are over 60 million. And we've won awards for the collaboration on that project. I think the key takeaways from that, from anyone setting up a project and the things that make it work, none of the projects we delivered were easy. Some of them were during COVID, some of them had ground contaminants, some of them also had cost plans that were inefficient. But the secret was that the trust didn't let go of the project. They didn't hand it over to consultancy. They stayed engaged with the project. They used a consultancy as their project managers, who actually knew what an NEC contract was and worked really hard with us throughout the projects to make sure that they were delivered using the NEC, and that the trust were kept informed and engaged throughout the process. I also think that it was really key that the problems weren't seen as contractor problems. Inflation wasn't seen as a contractor problem. It was a group problem, and the focus was on the projects, not the individuals. And we worked together on finding solutions. And that meant that both parties had to take a bit of pain, not just the contractor. So they had to go back to NHSE for more money. We're just about to open a CDC because the cost plan was wrong. We've we've supported the client in looking through at different options. We gave them all the information we could give them to back up talking to NHSE, but also we helped look at alternatives. We brought in different ways of building and different techniques. So if you truly work in partnership, and that involves people, not just the process, and getting the right people together, you get really good delivery. So all the 3 projects have been delivered now. They've all been delivered on time, and they've all been delivered just under the project original value. So the trust have now got money back to invest in other areas. And that's only possible because we all work together.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Brilliant example there of how that collaboration can work really well. Nicola, your views on this, please.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of examples that seem quite different, but I want to bring in because they've got a very similar theme, and actually a really similar theme to what Elizabeth was talking about, because it is all about the value of that partnership and the doing things together towards the shared outcome. So a couple of examples for us, both very different products or very different services we've been offering, but both interestingly with mental health trusts in our locality. The first one was a trust who were going through a very transformative time. They got new people in. They really wanted to revolutionise the way they delivered their services. They knew, so they had an overarching strategy, and then we're working on a series of enabling strategies, be that the clinical strategy, their estate strategy, the tech strategy. So they knew where they wanted to go and what they wanted to achieve as outcomes, but probably not actually clear on the actual outputs that they wanted from the piece of work. They weren't quite at the point where they were ready to do a by the book estate strategy, but they knew they needed some help on that thinking. And this is not to contradict any of the points that both Elizabeth and Karen made earlier on the importance of getting the brief right, because that is one of my absolute passion points about let's spend the time getting the brief right at the beginning to avoid problems later. But in this case, they almost couldn't be clear on the brief because they really didn't know. So it was about getting a partner who could work alongside them and be flexible and agile and pivot. So we all set off on this journey together, kind of knowing where we thought we might get to, but making sure we did not stick religiously to anything that had been in that original documentation, because as we probably got about a third of the way through, it became quite clear that wasn't the right direction to pursue. So, but it was a project we did through Pagabo, and I think it gave us that flexibility that we were on board, but we could work with them to actually say, no, we need to pivot, we need to change direction now to be able to deliver what you want as an outcome for this, rather than sticking to it religiously. And so that partnership collaborative process really came through. And if I may, the second one very quickly, again, another trust, very different service. This is more about capital program management. But again, that's enabled us to have a genuine long-term partnership with this particular client. We don't just go in on a transactional basis and they say, right, in these next 12 months, these are the exact things we want, please. We go in, go out. We've been working with them a number of years, very much embedded as part of their team. I guess, as you say, Elizabeth, that sort of pain share, making sure we're all driving towards the same outcome. And just really getting to know them as a trust, their service users, their buildings and their estate, so we can help them make better decisions. We're not just going in and they're saying, right, can somebody do this? Yes. We're actually being at the beginning part of that journey with them, helping them to make those decisions and then deliver them and see them through and incorporate the lessons into the next time round. So they're getting better value through that as a process, time after time after time, and better outcomes for the patients ultimately.
Excellent. Thank you very much, guys, for sharing those exemplars of great collaboration between NHS teams and external partners. Now we're going on to the final question of our 8 that we have for our panel so far. So if you do have any questions for our panel, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section now, and we'll get to those shortly. But it does say here in a sentence, but I'll definitely allow you more than a sentence. Feel free to expand as much as you'd like to on this one, because I think it is quite a hard one to boil down to a single sentence. But what does best practice look like to you in the future of NHS procurement and estates delivery? We'll go to you first. This one, Karen, please.
I definitely can't stick to a sentence.
I'll give you a sentence. We'll say 2 minutes. Let's keep it to 2 minutes.
2 sentences. Where do you start? I'm going to pick up on a point from Nicola there, which wasn't what I planned to pick up, to be fair, but it's a really valid point. I think where we're talking about the pressures of procurement processes, as Elizabeth pointed out earlier, are particularly coming out with a tender, open market, through framework, even however you're coming out to tender, having that really defined brief, depending on what it is that you're asking for. If you're coming out and asking for something to be priced, we need to know what you need pricing. We need complete clarity on that to get the right answers. Obviously, stands to reason. But I think to me, best practice, where we really see the power of partnership, and to be fair, going back on what I said earlier, if it's not a planned, we have so many people coming to us at the last minute going, I just need to do this. I don't care how it's done. I just need some help. I just need this. A lot of that's usually funding. I've got to spend this funding, or I need to do something really quickly. There's many different reasons, particularly with our NHS colleagues, that's the case. But I would say the best practice in the future is not hiding away with a specification. It's that it is that working together. And whether that's us, a direct link into our supply chain, whatever that looks like, particularly in working under a framework, you're kind of in a protected bubble, if you like. How it's a lot of ways that we talk to our clients of, you can't, as long as you're doing things consistently with everyone, you can't really go wrong. And you've selected a framework provider and a partner, however you want to contract that, whether it's going direct to a partner, whether you're going to tender it doesn't really matter. You don't need to go and hide in a darkened room somewhere with a specification and pop out with a tender that's amazing. Harness the expertise of the supply chains and the procurement partners around you and your colleagues. Ultimately, that's a lot of what we're trying to do, whether that's within the NHS of a trust down the road, or in a neighbouring county, or the opposite end of the country even, who've done a ward refurb, or they're feeling the same challenge that you are. That's what we strive to deliver, a better procurement future with that, where a ward refurb in, I'm going to pick up, I don't know why I've got Milton Keynes on the brain today, a ward refurb in Milton Keynes could have exactly the same problems as we've just experienced on ward refurb in Manchester, for example. Our teams know that. We're collating that kind of information in a really similar way to contractors are and consultant companies are, and they're all working together to overcome a lot of these problems. And there's really good working groups within the NHS, but again, the time pressures and the resources to collaborate internally to get to a point where you've got a really solid specification and a pricing schedule and everything that you would need to have to come to market, you don't really need to do that on your own. There's so much support around that can help to define that and make it a much easier process for you. And you're not doing anything wrong by doing that. I think there's such a taboo about, I can't speak to people, or I can't share this detail of this spec, or I can't really talk about this requirement in case there's some judgment, or I'll do something wrong, or I'm going to knack a process. You can't really break it that much. So consult, bring in the expertise, bring it in early, help them. You sort of lessen the load a little bit. You're not alone in any of these problems. There's always someone who's experiencing it somewhere. Sound like I'm giving some sort of lie on a sofa moment.
It's a live pep talk, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. You're not alone.
Problem shared is a problem halved, as they always say.
There's a lot of problems in procurement, isn't there? There's a lot that we're trying to deal with and juggle. So yeah, I think that, best practice is collaborate, speak to people, use people's positives, benefits, failures, lessons, whatever it might be, that we can use to really make these processes count, because we don't want to do them twice. A lot of the time they end up doing them 2-3 times before you get to where you want to be, which is just madness. So yeah, let's try and get it right.
Well, we mentioned early engagement there. Hopefully we'll get a chance to touch on that before we finish today. But we'll carry on with this question and go to you next, Nicola. What does best practice look like for you in the future of NHS procurement and estates delivery? And you definitely get more than a sentence, because Karen.
No, that's fine, because I think a bit like Karen, I thought about this and probably had something I was going to say, and I might have changed my mind now. But a much more simple response. I think for me, the best practice would just actually be bringing the right people together to solve the right problem, and as simple as that, really. So yes, collaboration, yes, partnership, but ultimately, I think a process that enables a trust, a practice, an ICB, a system, to go out there and find the right person to deliver the right thing for them, who had been the right person at that particular time to deliver that thing. That's really what best practice has to look like. And obviously, as a consultancy, we'd like to think sometimes that is us, but quite open to the sometimes that actually that won't be us all the time, and there'll be someone better for that thing at that time, and that's okay. But a process that enables that to happen without perhaps wasting people's time, effort, and energy on something that's never going to feel like the right fit. I think for me, that would be the utopia.
Excellent. And Elizabeth, the contractor view on this, please. The best practice for the future of NHS procurement and estates delivery.
Well, you know, Karen and Nicola haven't left me very much, but
covered off pretty much everything, haven't they?
Yeah, but at the end of the day, and it's a similar sentiment. We're contractors. We want to build and we want to help with the projects. So please don't be afraid to ask and don't be afraid to collaborate. We need to know what it is your problem is so that we can help you with that solution. So if the procurement's going to work, speak to people, and the more people you speak to, the better it will be.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that, guys. Really, some really good insight thus far. We're just about to open up our audience Q&A, so thank you for the panel for the responses thus far. We will go on to a final poll, though, just to check how confident people now are in the knowledge of public sector estates procurement. So same questions we asked at the start. Hopefully we'll see some progress being made there. So 1 being not very confident and 4 being very confident. So if you could just have 10 more seconds on that poll, please, before we close it and share the results. Brilliant. So if we close that now, please. And the good news is we've seen some positive movement there. So we've got, doing my quick maths, which anyone who's seen Pagabo live before will know I'm not particularly good at, but just over 70% there saying that they are either very confident or particularly confident. So good to see that the panel has finally built some knowledge there. Good stuff. And we'll move on now then to our Q&A. And I'd just like to go back actually to a point that's been kind of made a couple of times loosely, but not particularly driven home. The importance of early engagement, and particularly from a contractor side. I'd really like to get your view on this, Elizabeth. Just how important is it? We've talked about getting the brief right. We've talked about the collaboration side of things, but just how much of a difference does that early engagement make from a contractor perspective?
It makes a huge difference because it allows us to find out exactly what it is that the client needs. What are the main issues, and we can help because we can bring in specialists early. So we can stop people wasting time on designs or going down a certain rabbit hole, because we can bring in M&E, supply chain, we can bring in specialists who will look at the structures and be able to say, actually, that within the space that you have, this is definitely going to work. This won't work because of, or this could work, but here is the issues. And that allows you then to have a much more realistic idea of what the art of the possible is. And then you can go a bit forward a lot more confidently knowing what it is you're going to need. But more importantly, request the right budget then, both from NHSE through your business case, because time and again, some of these hidden things hit the budget very hard and you don't get what you want.
It goes back to that speed and efficiency argument as well that we were talking about earlier. Karen, how can frameworks play a role in that, and the frameworks that Pagabo helps manage? What's Pagabo's role in that, helping that early engagement?
I think just providing that sort of safe environment to consult. The sort of breadth of frameworks that we manage touch everything really, from sort of main contractors right down to sort of tier 3, 4 of the supply chain, like M&E contractors. We have specific solutions for really, really small works. So the breadth of experience that we've got alongside our consultant partners as well. It's that sort of safe access. You can consult. I think that's really what I was getting at before. Once you're within that space, you're not precluding anyone from that conversation. You ultimately, if you think, if you're procuring a £10 million extension to a hospital, for example, you've got a set of contractors there on a lot of a framework who are pre-qualified, who've got capped rates, they're ready, they know what they're doing with this project, they can build buildings all day long. One of them is going to be your building partner, so go speak to them, engage them. You know, there's, I'm not saying it's that easy, it's not. And there's a lot of driver, you know, there's, again, going back to our first conversation today, there's so many competing priorities that people are trying to juggle with here, that you don't always see that that is going to end up being the most efficient way to procure. And, you know, they want a price, they want a single, I think it's one of the questions I've noticed there in the Q&A as well. If they, you know, there is a bit of a reluctance in the market for single stage D&B type contracts. And again, that comes back to resource. Within, there's resource issues on the other side of the supply chain and contractors as well. You know, but sometimes single stage has its place. And again, that's fine. It doesn't mean that you're not going to come out and procure a project, and it might be single stage D&B, or it, you know, it might be a really basic first stage tender to get a preferred partner. Whatever that looks like, you can still engage, you can still do that, and you're still within a safe place to do it. And depending on what your project is, the project risks, the timescales you're working to, all of these objectives is what ultimately we're there as a team to do, is to take all of that burden from our clients procuring and go, right, here's a plan. here's a recommendation. We can facilitate all this. We'll work alongside you to do that, and you don't need to do it yourselves, and be that sort of guide along in the process. So yeah, that's certainly where we add the best value that we can. We can act quick, we get emergency projects, and we've got to come up with something, and we'll have something turned around in 2 days. And, you know, we've done direct awards within 24 hours, and things can move really quickly. And I'm not saying that sometimes provides really, really good value, and it sets the groundwork for great partnerships that have gone forward and developed, and contractors have stayed, you know, on multiple projects with a client following really quick appointments where they don't know each other. It can all work, but it's within that sort of safe space of knowing ultimately one of these contractors is going to be mine. How do I get the best out of that now without that commitment? I've still got that commercial tension. I've still got the means here to get multiple views of a thing before I move forward and select it by however you're going to select it. So yeah, I think that's ultimately where frameworks like ourselves add a bit more value.
And you sort of alluded to the question from Jason Hill at Leicester City Council, but it's good to get a consultant view on this from you, Nicola, and you're sort of slightly involved with this. But what do you think is the reluctance when it comes to undertaking sort of like two-stage procurement when it comes to those D&B type projects?
I think this is a really difficult one to answer, because so in a previous life I did work client side. I worked for local authority and then central government. I am again, I guess, preaching to the converted from Karen Elizabeth. I know in my role in local authority particularly, they're not obviously in a project management role, but not being a technical expert. I always really welcomed the value of actually bringing people on board really early, because it's you don't create something for yourself that then people get wedded to, and then a contractor comes along and ultimately then feels like the bad guy because they are changing something people have seen and felt comfortable with. And just that value of the contract being able to point out the things that you don't know, avoid you going down the pitfalls, and I think just a continuous learning opportunity as well. Really, if you are bringing somebody on early, or you've batched a group of schemes together, you can then go through the later ones at pace, but bringing in that learning. I think something Karen said earlier, particularly, do people still feel a bit nervous about it, in terms of, do they feel they're losing some control, or they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, or it feels a little bit naughty because it almost feels like you're giving away a prize too early without having all the required information to be able to truly test value for money, if that makes sense. I think it's probably, I think what puts people off is maybe a nervousness as opposed to not seeing the benefit of it. But Karen might have a better answer for that. I don't know.
Elizabeth's got a virtual hand up to. Is that an accidental?
It was an accidental one, but yeah, I would agree with what the girls have said with regards to this. A lot of people that I speak to think it's going to be expensive having the contractor early, but actually it saves money in the long term, because you're actually getting a project that's viable right from the outset, and you know that viability is there, so you can invest in that project. Time and time again, we are now even in two-stage tenders, seeing projects come into the market and they've had no M&E involvement at all, and that causes a huge problem, because that's where a lot of your money and expense is in your ventilation and your drainage and all these areas. So yeah, would agree.
Yeah, it was a bit of a nasty shock when the M&E guys get involved.
Yeah.
So that is unfortunately all we've got time for today. We do have another poll just appeared on that should appear on screen anytime now, just asking whether you would like any further email guidance on better healthcare procurement and estates delivery. So feel free to answer that yes or no if you'd like to be given some more information from the Pagabo Live team over the coming days and weeks. But that is unfortunately all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in, everybody. We've had a really good audience today and a very engaged audience as well. So thank you very much for your time today. And thank you to Elizabeth, to Karen, and to Nicola for your expertise. We're already getting some thank yous coming in on the Q&A, which is always lovely to see. So you're all now, if you've joined today's webinar, you are part of the Pagabo Live community. So what you'll do is you'll receive a link for all of our upcoming sessions. There's also going to be a newsletter coming out. It comes out around a week after each of the Pagabo Live sessions, which has a recording of the webinar in video form, and also in podcasts, which you can get on all of your favorite podcast listening platforms. So if you really do want to listen to us on Spotify in the car, you can do that. There'll also be further insights coming from the team alongside those emails. So another thing you can also get from Pagabo Live now is the CPD credit for today's session. So you'll be receiving an email from the Pagabo Live team about how you can do that over the coming days. As you can see on screen now, our next Pagabo Live is in a couple of weeks' time. Lucky you get 2 in July. We're going to be discussing how we can drive decarbonisation within the public sector. But as I say, that is all we have time for today. Thank you all very much again for your attendance, and we hope to see you again next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.